Welcome to Granny's Justice, a place where secrets are spoken and silence finally ends. From the very first breath I took, I was never a daughter. I was never a sister. I was property. My father's hands were the first prison bars I ever knew, rough, unrelenting, cold as iron. And when he grew tired of swinging them, my own brother stepped forward to keep the lock in place. Imagine being born into a family where love was nothing but a mask, where bedtime lullabies were replaced by whispered orders,
where every candle you blew out was a private wish for freedom that never came true. I wasn't raised. First by the man who gave me life, then by the brother who shared my blood. This is not a story dressed up to entertain. It is a confession, a warning, and in time, my reckoning. Before I go any further, tell me, where are you watching from? Type your city and your country in the comments. I want to know where my voice reaches, because no matter where you are, you deserve to hear a truth that nearly destroyed me. My name is Clara Mae Johnson. I am 78 years old, and I live in a salt-stung, weathered town called Portsmouth, Virginia. You might see a frail woman on a rocking chair, silver hair pinned back, a Bible folded on her lap. Don't be fooled. These bones carry old breaks and fresh storms. My voice may sound soft, but it has swallowed oceans. I speak because silence was the weapon my family used against me. They counted on my silence. They counted on me shrinking until I fit into the cracks they left behind. But if you are listening, if you are here, then I have already broken free. Lean in, listen closely. This is the blood-soaked truth of a childhood stolen, of a girl broken, and of a woman forged from the ashes of her own suffering. I was born the summer of 1947, in a wooden house that smelled of tobacco and kerosene. My mama was a pale, quiet thing, soft-voiced, worn down by illness, eyes always turned to the floor, as though the ceiling might bite her if she looked up. The midwife whispered I was a miracle, but my father's eyes told another story. He did not see a blessing. He saw another body to command. My earliest memory is not of a toy or a laugh. It is the sharp squeal of leather boots on wooden floorboards, my father coming home. I must have been 3, maybe 4. Even then, I knew that sound meant danger. His shadow filled the doorway long before he did. He was tall, broad, with fists quicker than kindness. The smell of sweat, bourbon and smoke clung to him like armor. Though I was only a child, I understood one hard thing. His love was a weapon. His presence, a cage. When I say he used me, I do not mean I fetched shoes or scrubbed floors alone. I mean he stripped me of childhood. By 5, I no longer played with dolls. I played servant. I fetched him meals before I could carry a plate steady. Cleaned ashtrays too heavy for my small hands. Learned to fold his shirts the exact way he wanted them. Mistakes were not forgiven. They were punished. The belt taught me what it meant to shrink. The cruelty lived in his hands and in his words. Useless girl. He'd hiss when I faltered. No man will ever want you. You belong to me. Those words cut deeper than leather. Even as a child, I believed them, and belief is a chain heavier than any iron. Mama would try to shield me. Not tonight, James, she'd whisper, wrapping her frail arms around me like a paper shield. Her pleading was thin paper against a roaring fire. She could not stop him. She could not protect what was, for all my childhood, already being stolen. When I turned 12, Marcus, my brother, was 16. He had father's broad shoulders and a jaw that could have been handsome, if not for the hardness in his gaze. If father was the storm, Marcus was the aftershock, quieter, colder. The kind of wind that finds the small cracks and widens them until a house breathes out. I prayed Marcus might be different. I prayed for a brother to be a brother. I was foolish. He had watched and learned. The ways of control were passed down. Orders began as simple things: clean my shoes, make my bed. But the lines blurred, as they always do when abuse grows comfortable. The chores became longer, the punishments sharper, the touches colder. The same prison father built, Marcus learned to keep tidy. By then, I was brittle. Resistance felt like trying to move a mountain with my hands. The house had a language of its own, whispered appointments, the scrape of chairs, a television left on low, to hum like a sleeping thing. We wore our fear like clothing. People in the town nodded politely when they saw us, the Johnsons from the corner house, and turned away without asking. Shame is a private thing. Folks pretend they cannot see it because admitting it would cost them something real. Do you know what it does to a child to be told she is nothing? To be told that her value is measured by obedience, not by anything soft or human inside her. It hollows you. I learned to make my face blank when the blows came. I learned to swallow words until they dissolved in my throat. I learned to be small, to fold myself into the spaces I was allowed. Sometimes I think the worst part was not the violence itself, but the way it taught me to expect nothing else. When hope rushed near, it was always pushed away. I wanted to believe in small mercies. A warm biscuit on Sunday, a gentle song from Mama. Those little lights were always snuffed. My father's anger was a calendar that predicted every day. Marcus's cruelty was the steady undertone that made the house hum with threat. There were moments, rare and fragile, when Mama would press her hand to my head and tell me she loved me. The love tasted like cough syrup, weak and medicinal, but it was real. She would hum a tune so quietly that only I could hear. In those moments, I was not property. I was a child, and I would close my eyes and pretend the world could be kinder. But those moments were brief. Father's shadow returned with a certainty that felt like the tide. Marcus would stand in the doorway and watch me with a patient hunger that made my skin crawl. The small kindnesses became dangerous spoilers in a life scripted for silence. Have you ever carried a secret so heavy it felt like a stone in your chest? Have you been betrayed by those who were meant to protect you? Tell me where you're watching from, your city, your country. Because we must remember this, pain like mine is not limited to Portsmouth. It lives in neighborhoods and houses all over the world. By sharing this, I hope you will know you are not alone. This was the beginning. Childhood turned into servitude. A family home greased with fear. Father taught me to be silent. Marcus learned to keep me that way. But the story does not stop in that small house. The next layer of the wound came when Marcus's control turned from chores and commands into something I could not name then. Something that would haunt every year that followed. In the next part, I will tell you how Marcus became more than a brother with orders, how he became a sentinel of my undoing, and how the chain around me tightened until I nearly disappeared entirely. By the time I turned 13, my father's lessons were carved into my bones. Silence meant safety. Obedience meant survival. Fear was the language we spoke without words. When his boots were not echoing down the hallway, you might have thought the house breathed easier. I thought that once, too. I learned the hard way that absence does not always mean freedom. Sometimes it only means the prison guard has changed shifts. That was when Marcus stepped forward, my brother. The boy I once hoped would keep me safe. He became another chain around my neck. At first it was almost laughable. A boy trying on a voice too large for him, imitating the only man he'd ever watched rule a home. Clara, fetch me water. Clara, don't sit until I say so. I told myself it was play acting, a way for him to feel grown. But the mimicry hardened into something colder. The imitation became habit. The habit became ownership. What made Marcus worse was that he knew me. He knew every small fear I carried, every tremor in my hands when someone raised a voice. He knew the exact sound I made when I swallowed a word. So he used those things like a locksmith uses keys, turning them gently until the last bolt clicked shut. At school, he was everything the town applauded. Captain of the basketball team, quick smile, teacher's pet. Girls whispered when he walked by. Boys tried to be like him. No one saw the other side of Marcus. Only I did. When the curtain dropped and the world stopped watching, his mask slipped. Behind closed doors, he was not the golden boy. He was a storm that bruised the air. He shoved me into walls. He barked orders as though I were his soldier. When I dared to make a sound once, twice, his laughter was worse than any strike. "Who do you think you are?" he spat. "You're nothing, Clara. Nothing but what we make of you." He said it the way my father had, soft and absolute. And each time those words sank me a little deeper. Mama lived like a ghost by then, her lungs thin as tissue, her body folding in on itself. She lay with the curtains drawn, breathing like someone who had forgotten how to take a full breath. Sometimes I would sit by her bed and hold her hand, feeling her skin like paper. Her voice was a candle guttering in wind. "Be strong, Clara," she breathed once, thumb stroking the back of my hand. "Be strong, because I can't protect you." That was the first instant I understood I was truly alone. Her love was pure, but it was not enough to shield me from the men who ran our house. It was a tiny light in a storm that would not stop when Mama died, 2 months after my 14th birthday. The fragile balance that had kept the house from falling collapsed. Father drank more, disappeared longer. And when he was gone, Marcus stepped up with the certainty of someone who'd been rehearsing for power his whole life. The house took his stride, and I had nowhere left to stand. I remember one summer night with a clarity that still tastes like metal. Cicadas screamed beyond the screen door. The kitchen light hummed above the table, where I traced a groove in the wood to keep my hands busy. Marcus leaned in the doorway, arms folded, a smirk that could have been a smile if not for the emptiness behind it. "You were always Mama's favorite," he said, the words low, measured. "But she's gone now. You've only got me." Silence felt safer, so I said nothing. But silence was no longer enough. He crossed the room and loomed close, his shadow swallowing the lamp's circle on the floor. "You belong to this family," he said, like a judge delivering sentence. "You belong to me." Those words weren't instructions, they were an ownership stamped into my skin. In them I heard both my father's echo and something new, something sharpened by youth and cruelty. Marcus was not simply a continuation of father. He was crafting his own authority, building chains from the same iron, but polishing them until they cut cleaner. By 15, I had no friends. Not because I wanted to be alone, but because Marcus made sure I was. If a girl from church tried to smile at me, Marcus's stare sent her running. If a boy lingered near my locker, Marcus met him in the parking lot and made it clear that anyone who paid me attention would pay a price. At first, I thought perhaps he was protecting me in his rough way, but protection is not a cage that keeps a person from living. He was isolating me, shaping my world so small that escape stopped seeming possible. He copied Father's tactics with a precision that disgusted me. Control by small erosions. Keep her too tired to think, too afraid to speak, too ashamed to ask for help. The same pattern that had been used on Mama was now perfected on me. I could watch the world from the window and see girls my age laughing in ways I could not remember how to do. The sight of joy became almost painful, a reminder of what had been taken. Still, and this is the thing they never saw, I was not entirely broken. Something stubborn and small lived inside me, a spark that refused to be smothered. In those late hours when the house was quiet and the moon made pale mirrors on the floor, that little flame whispered like a bird in a closed hand, "One day, Clara, one day you will make them regret it." I began to keep my own private rebellions. A saved scrap of paper folded into the hem of a skirt. A secret song hummed under my breath. A stolen minute at the creek where water ran over my fingers and felt like a world that hadn't been claimed. Those tiny things were dangerous. They were hope disguised as smallness. And hope is a treacherous thing to grow in a place that wages war on it. But I nurtured it like contraband, and in that dark, the seed of a future that did not belong to Marcus or father took root. Have you ever been silenced until your own voice felt foreign to your ears? Have you ever carried an ownership you did not consent to? Of your body, your choices, your very name? If you have, type yes in the comments. Tell me your city, your country. Silence only triumphs when we hide. When we name our wounds, they start to lose their power. Marcus thought he had won. Father thought he'd built obedience into me like armor. But neither understood this small, dangerous truth. The more you press a bird into a cage, the sharper her beak becomes. The girl they broke was still breathing. The woman she would become was already learning the shape of her anger. It would take time. It would take scars. But one day, and they could never have guessed how I would rise. And when I did, I would not whisper. I would roar. Asterisk when I turned 16. The world felt both like a map I knew by muscle, and like a country whose borders had been redrawn overnight. Cruelty was the ground I walked on, still beneath my ribs. Something like a reckless hope began to hum, quiet at first, then louder, like a single note demanding to be heard. Teenagers in town talked about dances and first crushes and college dreams. I watched them from the outside, tasting the air they breathed as if it were contraband. One late night, after Marcus had gone to the mill, and the house folded into that brittle silence that comes before everyone falls fully asleep, I stood at Mama's small window and stared at the street. The moon turned the road into a ribbon of silver. A radio played somewhere down the lane. For the first time in years, I let myself imagine leaving. Not forever at first. Just for a while to breathe air that wasn't measured and owned. My plan was laughable and fragile. Walk 2 miles to the bus stop. Ride until I reached a corner of town where nobody knew our name. Borrow $1 from Mrs. Hale next door. Hide in the back of a church van. Anything that would let me step off a bus into a life that didn't smell like stale tobacco and shame. The thought of stepping out of that house without them in my life felt like stealing a blessing. I had no right to imagine courage. I learned, is not a single dramatic act. It is a long series of risks, and the world charges a price. There was no grand unmasking when Marcus found out. There never is. The house had always been a map of small betrayals accumulating, until one day the paper tore. He noticed flour on my skirt from a pie I had borrowed. He noticed dust on my shoes. He noticed that I'd been whispering past the hour I was supposed to sleep. He had learned to read me like a book with brittle pages. That night in the kitchen, the light hummed low over the table. I bent to sweep crumbs. He came up behind me and touched my cheek, as if it were casual. His fingers left a cold I could not warm. "You think you can run," he said, voice flat. "You think the world will take you in." There was no question in it, only ownership sliding across my skin. They punished the idea before I could taste freedom. The punishments rarely left bruises big enough to show. They were quieter, more surgical. Marcus would turn the radio off mid-song. He would lock the pantry for days, so I couldn't even steal a glass of milk. He forbade me from tending Mrs. Hale's garden, that small kindness taken away, and sneered that I would never learn anything fine or useful. Withholding became his favorite weapon. Light taken, comforts denied. The small pleasures that remind a person she's still alive, removed one by one. Then, there were the nights when the air itself changed. Because Father or Marcus had drunk enough to make the house dangerous, I learned the cadence of threat, the wobble in a voice, the way the television's hum tightened into a wire. Once, in a memory I refused to forget, because forgetting makes it harmless. My father dragged me from bed and used chains of shame and words to bind me. They told me later that I would thank them. They said the world was cruel to women who had no protector. They said I would never survive without their hands on my life. That was the lesson. Coerced care, dressed up as protection, a currency that bought silence. The night I tried to leave left a sound in my ears that has haunted me for decades. Not a scream, not a shout, but the steady, grinding noise of hope being pulled out by its roots. I had folded my courage small, like the coins I once hid, and tucked it into my palm. My plan was nothing more than a thread. But threads can bind, or they can break. Marcus had been waiting at the gate. He didn't raise a hand. He didn't need to. He stood there like a judge with a sentence unspoken. The sight of his face was enough to collapse my plan like a house of cards. My feet dragged heavy as regret as I turned back into the darkened house. That night, when the air pressed against my ribs like an animal, they took more than my small dream. They took a new kind of ownership, one that marked the rest of my life in ways pitying whispers or Sunday prayers could never erase. I will not describe in detail what they did. Not because I am ashamed of the truth, but because honesty must not become exhibition. Know this, it was violence. Violence that hollowed out the spaces where my laughter once lived. Violence that turned my body into evidence against me. Violence that taught me, with a lesson older than history, that when family claims entitlement, the world outside will often look away. When it was over, I lay on the kitchen floor, listening to the refrigerator hum like a distant sea. Marcus staggered to his room and slammed the door. Father, drunk and disinterested, mumbled in his bed. I curled into myself until my bones remembered how to ache, and I felt older than my years could measure. After nights like that, the house never truly rested. Ordinary sounds, a stair creaking, a dish clinking, became alarms that sent me flinching into shadow. I learned to move like a moth circling a candle, quiet, careful, never touching flame. The bruises faded, but inside me the record etched itself in a language that never erases. The town said the usual things. Poor girl. She'll marry someday and be happy. Nobody asked the right questions. Nobody saw what I had become. A body stitched into a life by the hands of men who called it care. School carried on in its orbit. I scribbled essays about women who escaped and built lives from nothing, and sometimes a teacher would praise them. But when I looked at my reflection in the window, I felt like a stranger borrowing someone else's dream. I became precise in avoidance, avoiding mirrors, avoiding talk of marriage or futures. When neighbors gossiped about courtships, I smiled and nodded, then retreated to my room, where I boxed memories like unwanted gifts. Not long after that night, I discovered I was pregnant. The news was both enormous and suffocating. To learn that life was stirring inside me, in the same body that had been broken, was a contradiction too big to hold. Hope and terror braided together into a rope I clutched with both hands when I whispered the truth. Their reaction wasn't tenderness, it was calculation. Father muttered about shame and appearances. Marcus stared at me as though the world had handed him another object to possess. There were no promises of care, no vows of love, only arrangements, spoken in tones as cold as ledger entries. I knew this child was not an escape. It was another knot in the web. Yet impossibly something tender arose in me. Not joy, not yet, but a stubborn ember. I imagined a small face, a sound that could be mine alone, a heartbeat that answered only to me. It wasn't healing. It wasn't solution. But it was stubbornness refusing to die. With the pregnancy came bargains. Marcus softened his tone in public. Father muttered about propriety and reputation. They crafted illusions of a respectable family life, parading at church, nodding at neighbors, hiding the rot beneath polished smiles. I visited a doctor. Payments made in crumpled bills I never knew how they obtained. Mrs. Hale, kind and watchful, slipped me tins of sardines and loaves of bread with excuses about borrowed baskets. Her kindness tasted like medicine, but fear became a sharper tool. They told me I could not leave, not now, not with visible evidence that would shame us all. They called it protection. I knew it was a net, so I stayed. Not because I forgave, not because I agreed, but because survival sometimes isn't a heroic escape. Sometimes survival is a series of days endured, buying yourself time in small increments, a morning of reading, a walk to the mailbox, a loaf of bread you baked for yourself alone. The months reshaped themselves around my body. I whispered to the quiet corners of the house, making promises to a child who could not yet hear. Each whispered vow was a brick in an invisible wall of resolve. For the first time, I wasn't dreaming of leaving only for myself. The thought of a tiny hand one day curled into mine made escape no longer a fantasy. It became a mission. This shift was dangerous. Hope sharpens the blades of those who want to extinguish it. Marcus mocked the idea of me as a mother, jeering that it was a costume I could never wear, but beneath his words, I sensed calculation. A child was leverage, a new way to bind me. I began to write lists in secret, not letters to mail, but maps, names of relatives, addresses of distant cousins, fragments of people who might help. I gathered them like coins, hiding them in seams and hems. Every name was a seed. The end of this chapter wasn't a grand escape. It was smaller, quieter, more dangerous in its honesty. One winter evening, I packed a small bag, a few clothes, Mrs. Hale's address on a scrap of paper, a tin of biscuits, and the list of names I had been building like contraband. I didn't run. I walked. Running invites notice. Walking lets you blend. I stepped out in the hush between hours, when the house believed itself safe. I locked the back door softly and looked one last time at the porch that had witnessed so many humiliations. The night air trembled against my skin, but my heart steadied. I had no guarantee, no certainty. Only a promise that the life inside me would one day know safety if I could find it. That promise was iron in my hand. Behind me, the house groaned with silence. Ahead, the streetlights mapped, a path pale and thin, but mine. With each step, I felt the truth of decision, not the rashness of a child, but the deliberate step of a woman who understood the stakes. When you carry a secret inside you, the secret becomes a shape that changes the way you move through the world. It presses against your ribs. It reorients your eyes. It asks of you a new vocabulary. How to be invisible and present at once. How to cradle life beneath a bone-deep fear. I gave birth to my child in the quiet between the seasons, not in a hospital with bright lights and women in white, but in a small room that smelled of starch and lemon oil, under the careful hands of Mrs. Hale and one soft-spoken midwife. The town had its judgments and its busy tongues, and I had learned the art of keeping things inside the lines of propriety so people would not pry. When my son was small, and I will call him Samuel, because names help me hold moments steady, I learned a trade that had nothing to do with stitches or coins. I learned how to mask terror with lullabies. I learned which window to leave ajar so air might travel through the house and carry with it a sense of ordinary life. I learned how to make a child's laughter live, even when my own voice wanted to break. Samuel was not a solution to anything. He was not a bandage people could use against their consciences. He was a warm, small hand that fit inside mine, a breath that answered only to me in a world that often tried to speak for me. There was a tenderness in the beginning that surprised me, not the maudlin, cinematic kind, but the kind that sits quietly and alters the angle of your heart. When he slept, I would study his face as if trying to memorize a constellation. I would hum nonsense songs and press my forehead to his soft curls and promise things into the darkness that I might not yet keep out at night. When the house was loud with the creaks of habit and the slow, familiar noises of men who believed they owned the world, I would rock him and whisper promises like prayers. I will keep you safe, as much as I can. I did not yet know how much that promise would cost me. I only knew that it felt like the right kind of sin to commit in a crooked world. Mrs. Hell helped where she could. She brought stew that tasted like summer and patched my clothes with a tenderness I had not seen since my mother was alive. She would knock on the back door and say, "I brought a bit of bread and some milk. You can keep the change, child," and I would accept with hands that shook. There were other small mercies. A seamstress who mended a hole in a coat and refused payment. A Sunday school teacher who lent me novels and looked at me with more curiosity than suspicion. Kindness in small doses kept me alive. It was not rescue. It was a net. I became a woman split between two worlds. In the daylight, I was careful and economical. Chores, biscuits baked. Samuel dressed in the neat hand-me-downs Mrs. Hale sent. I went to market with my head down and returned with pockets full of small changes that made my breath easier. I learned to greet neighbors with the right combination of demureness and gratitude so they would. Never ask the wrong questions. At night, when the house quieted, the other life unfurled. Inventory of threats, strategies of avoidance. Mapping who might notice if I left, and who would turn away if I stayed. Each day was a ledger of minor calculations. How to pay for milk. Where to hide Samuel if a neighbor came by unannounced. Whether to accept a churchwoman's offer for baptism that included a small party and thin gossip. I hid things in the seams of my existence. A folded list in an old Bible. A coin under the floorboard. The address of a cousin stitched into a hem. Each item was a small plan. A possibility. I learned to be patient in a way I had not known before. Patience when you are carrying a child is not meekness, it is strategy. Marcus and Father remained, in the public eye, predictable men. Father had become quieter in some ways, slower in his steps, the drink moving into the hollow spaces of his days. Marcus had a job. He worked shifts at a plant, and came home smelling of iron and grease. Both men kept their power with a mixture of brute force and careful optics. A wave at the church bazaar. A donation to the Sunday fund. An upheld door for a neighbor. They were respectable, but respectability is a thinner veneer than kindness. Marcus's eyes would still flick toward the back room when I went to tuck Samuel in. Father would ask, once in a while, where the household money had gone, or why I was out visiting Mrs. Hale more often. Their questions sounded casual, almost forgetful. They were never the kind of straightforward interrogations that might be answered in a way that satisfied them. They wanted explanations that kept me inside the circle. I lived with that quiet pressure always at my shoulder. There were nights when I checked locks twice and counted windows like a litany. There were times when I hid Samuel in the hollow of a closet while talking with Father in the kitchen, letting him think I was the dutiful woman he expected. That kind of deception is not heroic. It is survival. Small towns are peculiar things. They can cradle you and also weigh you down with opinions. I found there were people who saw and chose to look away, and people who saw and reached a hand. The difference between the two became one of my most vivid lessons. At church, women complimented my singing. The pastor's wife shook my hand and smiled with a softness that almost made me confess everything. At the bakery, Mr. Olson would slide a cinnamon roll into my bag without charging. These were gestures that stitched warmth into the fabric of my days. But there was also the gossip that followed, like breath, the silent tutting, and the sideways glances. People muttered about a falling away in our family, about hard times. No one publicly spoke of Marcus's mood or Father's hands. In towns like mine, it was easier to call it misfortune than to stare at it directly. Even in that narrow life, there were triumphs that felt enormous. The first time Samuel walked across our kitchen without falling, I cried into my apron. The first time he said "Mama" properly. It was as if a small bell had been struck inside me, and resonance flooded every cracked corner. Those little victories are the kind that make the rest bearable. I got work mending uniforms for the school, stitching patches onto sleeves, hemming trousers, and the money I earned was mine to hide. I kept receipts in a small tin. For the first time since the coins Marcus had taken, I felt a small bloom of control. I used that money for bread, for a coat Samuel could wear, for a tiny wooden toy I carved from a scrap of oak. The toy was disproportionate to my means, but it belonged to no one but my child. Those acts felt like rebellion. Not the world-changing kind, but the quieter insurgency of a woman taking back small parts of her life, as comforting as the small mercies were. The shadow of my family persisted. Marcus did not abandon his need for control. He merely shifted it into subtler forms. He began to use the leverage of my child to keep me obedient. "If you upset me, Clara," he would say softly, "you will not see him for a long time." We all learn what words wound most. Quickly, a mother learns to barter with what she values most. I bargained with time, with small allowances, with Sunday visits, with a dozen tiny trades so Samuel might have a life that looked ordinary to anyone who glanced in our window. I became a negotiator in the language of survival. And yet, though I negotiated and navigated and stitched my days together, I felt a pressure building. Control wants perpetuity. It does not enjoy cracks. The work that men like Marcus and my father did to bind a woman was resilient. It adapted. And it began finding new ways to tighten. Children grow whether the world is ready or not. Samuel's legs found their rhythm on creaky floorboards. His laughter spilled into rooms that had forgotten the sound of joy. And his first words were like sunlight forcing its way through cracks in boarded windows. He said "Mama" with a certainty that startled me, as if he already knew. I was both shield and sword, but the house was not kind to him. Father scowled at the noise, muttering about undisciplined brats. Marcus looked at him with a strange mixture of disdain and possession, as though Samuel was not a nephew but a complication. I watched those looks carefully. I knew the ways men like them trained their eyes before they trained their hands. My whole life had been a lesson in reading those signs. So I did what mothers do. I guarded him. I taught him how to lower his voice when the boots hit the porch. I made a game of hiding under the bed when footsteps grew too close. I turned survival into play because that's how you teach a child to live without breaking his spirit. At first, I thought the community might save me. Mrs. Hale tried. The pastor's wife gave me a Bible with thin pages that smelled like dust and new hope. But whispers are powerful in a small town. Some neighbors who once smiled began to cross the street when they saw me. They did not ask why bruises bloomed or why Samuel rarely played in the open. They didn't need to. They had their story already, one that made them comfortable. "Poor girl," they said behind closed doors. "Such a shame. Fell in with the wrong crowd. Not she is trapped. Not she needs help, just shame. Shame is the easiest way to bury truth." And in that soil, my silence grew heavier. As Samuel grew, Marcus sharpened a new kind of cruelty. He learned quickly that the surest way to control me was through my son. He never raised his hand to Samuel, not at first, but he threatened absence. He would corner me in the hallway, voice low and even, "If you cross me, you'll never see him again." Those words sliced sharper than belts or fists. Because the mother's fear is not for herself, it is for the small heart that beats outside her body. One winter night, after I had managed to sew enough to buy Samuel a second-hand coat, Marcus took it from the peg. He held it up like a prize and said, "You think he needs this? He needs discipline, not charity." He tossed it onto the fire. I watched the wool smolder, the smoke curling like fingers against the ceiling, and held Samuel close while his small body shook with confused sobs. That was the night I began to hate Marcus, not only as a brother, but as a man who wanted to stamp out light wherever he saw it. Grief demands expression. Silence demands an outlet. so I began to write. In the dark hours after Samuel slept, I tore pages from old school books and filled them with words. Not polished sentences, not essays like the ones teachers had once praised, but raw confessions. They will not break me. He is mine. One day I will leave. Those pages became my secret allies. I hid them in a loose board beneath my bed. Every time I felt myself sinking into the old silence, I touched the notebook and remembered, I was not only surviving, I was documenting. I was bearing witness, even if no one else would read it. Someday, Samuel might. And maybe then he would know the truth of his mother's fight. Not everyone looked away. There was one man, a school janitor, named Mr. Carter, who seemed to notice what others did not. He had the quiet kind of kindness, the kind that doesn't demand thanks. Once, after seeing me walk home with Samuel in the rain, he pressed a small umbrella into my hand. "Keep it," he said simply. Another time, he slipped me a sandwich wrapped in wax paper. "Too much for me," he muttered, though we both knew it wasn't true. I never confessed my secrets to him. But in those small gestures, I felt a reminder. Not all men were made of the same cruel clay. Some were built of mercy. The breaking point came when Samuel was 3. He had a fever that burned through the night, his small body trembling in my arms. I begged Father for money to take him to a doctor. He sneered, slamming his glass on the table. "Let the boy sweat it out," he said. Marcus muttered that weakness breeds weakness, but I had learned something in those years of silence. Desperation can turn even the most timid woman into steel. I wrapped Samuel in a blanket, stepped out into the freezing night, and walked barefoot through the snow until I reached Mrs. Hale's porch. I pounded on her door, wild with fear. She didn't hesitate. She bundled us into her kitchen, brewed broth, pressed cool cloths to his forehead. By morning, the fever broke. I cried then, not only from relief, but from the realization that I had saved him. Not them, me. My choice, my steps, my refusal to obey. It was a small triumph, but it lit a fire that would not go out again. That night marked a pivot. I began to see the truth. Father and Marcus were not gods. They were men, cruel, ordinary, fragile in their power, once it was resisted. Samuel's fever had forced me to act, and acting had worked. From then on, every secret plan I made carried more weight. I was no longer only dreaming of escape. I was preparing for it. The journals grew thicker. The list of safe names lengthened. And my will, the part of me they had tried to stamp out, grew sharper with every breath. When I turned 19, the calendar meant little to anyone but me. My father didn't notice. Marcus certainly didn't. To them, I was still the girl they had molded into silence. But I noticed. I noticed the weight of it in my chest, the way the air tasted sharper that morning, the way the mirror reflected not a girl, but a woman whose eyes had begun to harden against the walls of her prison. I had survived adolescence under their rule. I had carried a child into the world. I had seen Samuel's fever break in my arms. And I had written every detail in the journals beneath my bed. 19 wasn't a celebration. It was a milestone proof that I had endured longer than they wanted me to. The difference between 18 and 19 may seem trivial, but to me, it was the difference between enduring and planning. 18 was a girl hiding coins under floorboards. 19 was a woman daring to think of a future that belonged to her. Our house stood on the edge of Portsmouth, where the dirt roads met the paved ones, and the tobacco fields gave way to storefronts. I used to watch the world from behind the fence carriages when I was young, then trucks and buses as the years changed. People carried parcels, groceries, even radios, their faces lit by errands and purpose. I envied their ordinariness. I envied the way they could walk home with bread without fear. I envied the way their laughter carried down sidewalks without chains to choke it. By 19, I stopped only envying. I began to test the fence. I took work mending uniforms at the school. I stretched those errands into longer walks. I lingered at the library, pressing Samuel close while I filled his head with stories of heroes and journeys. And slowly, I began to collect not just coins, but connections, thin, delicate, but real. The librarian, Mrs. Duncan, would slip me books with quiet eyes that seemed to say, "I know there's more here than you're telling me." A grocer once let me carry home bruised fruit free of charge. Mr. Carter, the janitor, continued to nod kindly whenever our paths crossed. These were crumbs of mercy, and I followed them like a trail. But men like Marcus can smell freedom before it flowers. He noticed the new books in the house. He noticed the time I took at the market. He noticed Samuel's growing boldness, his laughter ringing out when we played hide-and-seek in the yard. Marcus didn't strike immediately. He never did. He let the rope out just long enough for me to step into the illusion of slack. Then he tightened it. One evening, he sat at the table, arms crossed, jaw tight. Samuel slept in the next room, his small breaths steady. Marcus looked at me the way a man looks at a ledger he intends to balance. "You've been wandering," he said flatly. I froze, the needle in my hand slipping against the patch I was sewing. "Just errands," I murmured. "Errands," he repeated, tasting the word like it was poison. "You think people don't talk? They see you out there, Clara. They see you pretending you belong to them." I lowered my eyes, but inside, something bristled. Pretending. No. I did belong, not to them, not to him, not to Father, to myself, to Samuel. But I didn't say it. Not yet. Father was slower now. But cruelty doesn't need strength. It only needs presence. He spent his nights with bourbon, his mornings with bitterness. Sometimes, he muttered about wasted lives. Mama's, mine. He never said Marcus's name in vain. Marcus was his heir, his legacy of control. But even Father sensed something shifting in me. Once, when I was humming to Samuel, he slammed his glass down and snarled, "Stop that noise. You sound too alive, too alive." That was the sin they feared most. Not disobedience, not defiance, life. The first true taste of independence came from a letter. Mrs. Duncan pressed it into my hand one afternoon. "A cousin in Norfolk," she whispered, "runs a boarding house. She might take you in. It's not much, but it's a way." My heart hammered as I slipped the letter into my apron. I read it that night under the thin glow of a candle, Samuel curled beside me. The cousin wrote simply, "If you can get here, I have work and a room. You'll be safe, safe." The word felt foreign on my tongue, almost holy. I began to plan again. Not the childish plans of coins under floorboards, but a woman's plan. Train schedules. Money hidden in hems. Trusted names scribbled in code. I didn't know if I could make it, but the possibility breathed like a second heartbeat in my chest. Freedom has a scent. It clings to your clothes, seeps into your words, sharpens the way you move. Marcus smelled it. One night, he cornered me in the hallway, the air heavy with tobacco and sweat. "You think you can leave?" he said softly, dangerously. "But you can't. You belong here. You belong to us." I lifted my chin, a small act, but one that felt enormous. "I don't belong to you," I whispered. The silence that followed was thick enough to choke me. His eyes narrowed, his jaw clenched, and in that moment, I knew I had declared war. The retaliation was swift. He locked me out of errands. He tightened his grip on Samuel, demanding I ask permission for every outing. Father muttered about ungrateful daughters. The house grew colder, smaller, heavier. But inside, something had changed. For the first time, I had spoken the truth aloud. "I don't belong to you." The words burned, but they lit a fire that could not be extinguished. That letter from Norfolk became my secret gospel. I read it every night by candlelight, tracing each word like scripture. Workroom, safe. Just 3 promises. But they were enough to set my heart racing in the dark. I hid the paper in the lining of my apron, stitched carefully where no eye would linger. During chores, I would touch the seam, a silent reminder that a door, however small, had cracked open in the walls of my prison. The house grew more dangerous with every beat of my hope. I moved differently. I hummed when I shouldn't have. My eyes held light they thought they had extinguished. And Marcus noticed. He always noticed. The first mistake I made was trusting the wrong person. I thought I could confide in Ruthie Ann, a girl from church with honey brown curls and a laugh that made people want to stand closer. We'd exchanged glances for months, little smiles, little kindnesses, and I mistook that for safety. One afternoon, after service, I pulled her aside and whispered about Norfolk, about the cousin, about the letter. Her eyes widened. She clasped my hands and said, "Clara, that's wonderful. You deserve to get out." For a moment, my chest filled with a kind of warmth I hadn't felt since Mama was alive. But warmth is not always shelter. Sometimes it is bait. By evening, Marcus knew everything. He stormed into my room, fists clenched around the letter I had hidden. I froze, my breath strangling in my throat. "Norfolk," he hissed, "a boarding house. Safe." He spat the word like poison. "Who told you you had the right to even think about this?" I shook, tears brimming, but inside I cursed myself more than him. "Ruthie Ann, how could you?" Marcus ripped the letter in half, then quarters, then smaller, until the words I had worshipped were nothing but scraps on the floor. "You'll never leave," he growled. "Not with Samuel. Not without him. You're ours, Clara. Ours." He left me there, staring at the shredded pieces. I gathered them in trembling hands, pressing them to my chest like ashes of a burned prayer. That night, I learned another lesson. Freedom must be guarded like fire in the wind. Trust is not a gift to give lightly. Father joined in the punishment the next morning. His voice, raspy from years of bourbon, carried the same authority it always had. "You shame this family," he sneered. "Running off to strangers, making us look like fools. You think you can raise a child on your own? No, that boy is ours as much as yours." The weight of his words fell harder than fists. Not only was my body claimed, now my child was too. I didn't argue. I didn't weep. I lowered my eyes and swallowed the rage like a blade. But inside, a voice had begun to whisper louder. "If you want him to live free, you will have to fight harder. You will have to outsmart them." In the weeks that followed, whispers spread. Ruthie Ann's betrayal had not been limited to Marcus. The whole congregation knew of my wild ideas, my foolish plan. Women glanced at me with pity. Men smirked. One Sunday, the pastor preached about a woman's place and the dangers of rebellion. His words were aimed at me, though he never spoke my name. Shame sat heavy on my shoulders, but beneath it, something else simmered. Contempt. They wanted me to believe I was a cautionary tale. But I was not a warning. I was a fuse. Not everyone abandoned me. Mrs. Hale continued her quiet kindness, slipping me loaves of bread, whispering encouragement. Mr. Carter gave me an envelope with a train schedule folded inside. "Just in case," he said softly. He never asked questions. He only gave tools. Even Mrs. Duncan at the library, though she didn't speak of Norfolk again, pressed extra books into my hands. Stories of women who crossed oceans, women who rebuilt after wars, women who raised children alone. Each book was a spark, a reminder that my life could still stretch beyond this town. Through it all, Samuel grew. His laughter remained unbroken, his questions endless. "Mama, why does Uncle Marcus always scowl?" he asked once. I knelt, cupping his soft cheeks. Because he doesn't know how to be happy, I whispered. Samuel was my tether to life, my reason to endure. Every bruise I hid, every humiliation I swallowed, I did with his future in mind. If I couldn't escape for myself, I would for him. Months later, I tried again, not with letters this time. Not with whispers to friends, I had learned. This time, I planned in silence. I saved coins for mending uniforms. I bartered bread for buttons, buttons for fabric, fabric for pennies. Slowly, carefully, I built a hidden fund. I mapped the train station in my head, memorizing which doors stayed unlocked at night. I taught Samuel how to stay quiet, how to hold my hand without question. One spring evening, when the air smelled of rain and the town buzzed with a festival, I took Samuel by the hand and stepped toward the station. My heart pounded like war drums. Freedom was close enough to taste, but freedom is never free. Marcus was waiting at the platform. He grabbed my arm before I could step onto the train. His grip was iron, his smile cruel. "Did you really think you could outsmart me?" he hissed. "You're nothing without us. Nothing." Samuel clung to me, his small body trembling. I wanted to scream, to fight, to drag us both onto that train. But Marcus was stronger, and the eyes of strangers turned away, unwilling to involve themselves. He pulled us back, away from the train, away from hope. The whistle blew, the cars rolled forward, and my chance slipped into the night. Back at the house, Father waited. His silence was worse than any words. He lit a cigarette, inhaled, and said only, "Don't test us again," that night. As I held Samuel close, tears soaking his hair, I made a vow. I would never trust the wrong people again. I would never announce my plans. I would not beg, or plead, or explain. I would become the shadow in their house, silent and unnoticed, until the day I struck. They thought they had broken me by dragging me back. What they didn't know was that they had only hardened my resolve. Each failure was not an ending, it was training. After Marcus dragged me from that train platform, silence became my shield. I moved through the house like a ghost, hands busy, eyes lowered, voice scarce. To them, it looked like submission. To me, it was strategy. The less I spoke, the more I listened. The more invisible I became, the freer I was to plan. I had learned the most important lesson of survival. Your enemy must never know when you are gathering strength. I became to women the obedient Clara who served meals, mended clothes, and lowered her head. And the hidden Clara who mapped escape routes, memorized schedules, and wrote plans in the margins of old hymnals. Children notice more than we think. Samuel was nearly 6 then, and his questions had sharpened into something more dangerous than curiosity, awareness. "Why does Uncle Marcus always follow us?" he asked one afternoon, his small brow furrowed. I hesitated, tucking his shirt into his trousers. "Because he doesn't understand what love means," I said carefully. "But we don't belong to him," Samuel pressed. His voice carried that innocent certainty children often have. "We belong to us." Those words stopped me cold. Out of the mouth of my child came the truth I had been too afraid to speak. We belong to us. I knelt, taking his hands in mine. "That's right," I whispered. "Never forget it. No matter what anyone tells you, we belong to us." From that day forward, Samuel became not just my reason for freedom. He became my partner in remembering who we were. But Marcus sensed the shift. Perhaps it was in Samuel's boldness, perhaps in the steadiness of my gaze. He responded the way all tyrants do, by tightening control. He began checking on us more often, his eyes lingering too long on the small bag I kept near the bed, his questions about where we went thick with suspicion. He intercepted letters from the post, accusing me of secrets I hadn't even written. One evening, he stood in the doorway as I tucked Samuel in. "You still dreaming of Norfolk?" he sneered. I froze, my hand hovering over Samuel's blanket. "No," I whispered. Marcus leaned closer, his breath sharp with tobacco. "Good. Because if you ever try again, you won't just lose. You'll lose him." The implication was clear, and I swallowed the terror whole, pressing it deep inside until it hardened into something sharper. It was Mrs. Duncan, the librarian, who gave me the tool I didn't know I needed. She slipped me a book one afternoon, bound in faded blue. The title barely legible, The Art of War. I frowned at her, confused. She only smiled softly and whispered, "Sometimes battles aren't fought with fists." That night, I read the book by candlelight, tracing the ancient words with trembling fingers. Strategy, patience, knowing your enemy better than they know themselves. These weren't just lessons for soldiers. They were lessons for women like me, trapped in houses that masqueraded as homes. For the first time, I realized revenge was not rage. Revenge was patience sharpened into precision. From then on, every day became practice. When Marcus barked orders, I obeyed outwardly but noted the cracks in his routine. The nights he drank too much, the mornings he overslept, the hours his guard was lowest. When Father rambled about respect and legacy, I smiled softly and memorized the slurs that revealed his weakness. And with Samuel, I began to train in secret. Not with weapons or fists. He was still a child, but with words. I taught him how to lie convincingly if someone questioned him. I taught him how to hide small objects without detection. I taught him which neighbors were safe, which were not. How to tell the difference by the way their eyes lingered. We turned survival into a game. And in that game, Samuel learned resilience before most children learn multiplication. To the town we looked ordinary. I attended church. I sewed uniforms. Marcus worked. Father drank. Samuel played. The facade was nearly perfect, but cracks appeared when people looked too closely. Once Mrs. Hale asked gently why I looked so tired. Another time, the pastor's wife noticed the bruise I failed to hide under my sleeve. Their eyes filled with pity, but their mouths stayed shut. That silence burned, but I understood. People fear what happens when they interfere. So I stopped expecting rescue. Instead, I started weaving rescue with my own hands. One spring night, a storm rattled the windows, lightning splitting the sky like a warning. Marcus had been drinking, his mood unpredictable. Samuel clung to me, whispering, "Mama, tell me a story." So I told him one, not from the Bible, not from the books at the library, but from my own heart. A story about a bird trapped in a cage. The cage was strong, I whispered over the thunder, but the bird's wings were stronger. She waited. She studied the lock. And one day, when the storm raged, she pushed, and the door gave way. Samuel's eyes lit with wonder. Did the bird fly away? Not yet, I said softly, holding him close. But she will. And when she does, she never looked back. It was both a promise and a prophecy. Children don't stay silent forever. What they see, they eventually speak. One afternoon, Samuel was playing in the yard with a stick he pretended was a sword. Marcus came home from his shift, grease on his shirt, and scowled at the sight. "You look ridiculous," he snapped. "Put that away before I break it." But Samuel stood his ground, the stick held like a soldier's blade. "You don't tell me what to do," he said, voice steady. "You're not my father." My heart stopped. Marcus's face darkened, his fists clenching at his sides. For a moment, I thought he would strike Samuel. But something in my eyes must have warned him, because instead, he laughed, low and cruel. "Not your father," he said, leaning down until his nose nearly touched Samuel's. "Boy, you don't even know who your father is." The words struck like a stone. Samuel's small body stiffened, his sword stick lowered. He looked at me, confusion and hurt filling his wide eyes. I pulled him to me before Marcus could say more, whispering, "Don't listen. He wants to hurt you with lies." But that day, innocence cracked. Samuel understood, perhaps for the first time, that the men in this house were not just mean. They were enemies. It was Ruthie Ann again who struck next. She had married by then, living in a small house near the church. I thought marriage might have softened her cruelty, but bitterness ages faster than years. One Sunday, after service, she cornered me in the vestibule. Her lips wore a smile, but her words were daggers. "Heard you're still dreaming of running away," she whispered. "You should be grateful, Clara. Some women don't even have roofs over their heads." I stared at her, trembling with the urge to scream. Grateful for chains, 4 nights stolen, for a childhood buried. But I bit my tongue. Rage wasted on ears that delight in pain is still a loss. By evening, Marcus knew again. Ruthie had carried my whispers, or maybe invented them back to him. He stormed into the kitchen, slammed his fist against the table, and snarled, "You never learn. If you keep testing me, I'll make sure that boy grows up without you." The threat was clear. They were no longer just using me. They were using Samuel as the weapon. I began to notice how much the town knew, even if they pretended otherwise. When I walked into the market, conversations hushed. When Samuel and I sat in church, whispers swirled around us like gnats. Everyone knew, but no one acted. There is a cruelty in silence that rivals the cruelty of fists. It is the cruelty of neighbors choosing comfort over conscience. They told themselves it wasn't their business. They told themselves interfering might make things worse. And so they did nothing. It was in that nothingness that my resolve sharpened. If justice was going to come, it wouldn't come from them. It would come from me. I began to hide things. Small things Marcus would never suspect. A kitchen knife wrapped in cloth under the floorboard. A few dollars sewn into Samuel's coat lining. A bottle of water tucked beneath the porch steps. Each item was not just survival. It was resistance. Each day I managed to hide something without detection felt like a victory. I also began to teach Samuel more deliberately. We would play spy games where I'd hide coins or scraps of bread, and he'd have to find them without making a sound. I taught him to read signs in people's faces, when to speak, when to stay silent. He learned quickly, his sharp eyes missing little. Together, we were building a language of survival, one Marcus could never decipher. One evening, Marcus came home drunk, angrier than usual. Father was slumped in his chair, useless with liquor. I was sewing at the table, Samuel drawing beside me. Marcus staggered in, slammed at the door, and barked, "Why is he drawing? Boys don't need to waste time with pencils. He needs discipline." Samuel's small voice cut the air. "I don't need anything from you." The room froze. My needle slipped from my fingers. Marcus's face twisted, and he stepped forward, hand raised. Before I could think, I moved between them. "Enough," I said, my voice low but steady. "You will not touch him." The silence that followed was electric. Marcus stared at me as though I had grown horns. For the first time, I had spoken not in whispers, not in negotiation, but in command. He didn't strike me. He didn't strike Samuel. He only laughed, that same cold, humorless laugh. "You think you're brave now," he sneered. "But bravery won't save you. One day, Clara, you'll regret opening your mouth." But as I held Samuel close, trembling, I realized something. Marcus hadn't hit us. My words had stopped him. Not because he respected them, but because, for the first time, he had seen a glimpse of the fire I was hiding. And fire makes even tyrants cautious. They called it patience. I called it preparation. After I whispered that one dangerous word, revenge, into the dark. Every small thing I did felt like a rehearsal. I practiced how to smile when Marcus prowled the kitchen. I practiced how to look like a woman who had nothing to hide when the pastor's wife offered her pity. I practiced being ordinary, because ordinary is the best disguise. But ordinary was only the costume. Underneath, I was assembling pieces, friends who owed me favors, small notes that would one day stitch into a case, memories that could be called to the stand. My revenge would not be a sudden blaze. It would be slow, meticulous, and public, the kind that makes men who thought themselves untouchable disappear behind their own reputations. Every day had its tiny rebellions. I refused to let Marcus flinch, my boy. When he ordered Samuel to scrub the porch at midnight, I said no, and guided the child back to bed. When he wanted to control the money, I rerouted small payments, an extra alteration job here, a neighbor's sewing request there into my hidden tin. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would put Samuel or me at immediate risk. But the small acts collected like rain filling a barrel. Eventually, there would be enough Samuel noticed the differences. He learned to fold his voice low when strangers were near, to hold his head as if the world owed him nothing. He also learned to keep watch. When he saw strangers with keys, or saw men linger too long at the market, he would later tell me in whispers, and I would scribble notes in the margins of the hymnal on my lap. The pieces were coming together. Mr. Carter began to do favors that made him look like nothing more than a kindly janitor. But one night, he slipped me a catalog of men who had recently left town for other jobs. Names, dates, places. Mrs. Duncan continued to lend me books of law and women's stories. And she taught me how to frame a claim so the town couldn't ignore it. Mrs. Hale fed Samuel more than soup. She fed him observation, who visited late, which houses kept odd hours, which men had a temper that turned mouths silent. I collected these things like a woman collecting matches. Cruelty adapts. Marcus realized brute force was less effective now that I had found a backbone. So he became clever. He withheld, he belittled, he used the town's moral codes like chains. He spread rumors, implying I was unstable, that I might harm the child, that I was a woman with dangerous notions about independence. He hoped the town would shrink away from me. For a while, it worked. A few neighbors crossed the street when we walked by. The pastor's wife kept her distance. Ruthie Ann, whose compass only pointed toward gossip, smiled in public and stabbed with whispers in private. It felt like being under a cloud that never rained kindness. But rumors also have a cost. They must be fed, and they must be believed. Rumors need witnesses. And witnesses have memories. I began asking the right people, quietly, to remember what they had seen. I asked Mrs. Hale if she would swear that Marcus had once threatened me in the pantry. I asked Mr. Carter if he would say, under oath or not, that he had seen Marcus strike me once, years ago, when father was out. These were not bets. They were groundwork. There is a strange economy in small towns. One based on moral currency. Who gives to whom? Who plays in the church choir? Who hosts the bake sale? Marcus and father had spent decades buying themselves respectability, handing over time and money, fixing a fence here, sponsoring a team there, and that ledger had bought them silence from many. It is not always cowardice. Sometimes it's self-preservation. People know how easily reputations slither under criticism. So my fight turned into leverage. If their good name was their shield, I had to strike at the shield in a way that couldn't be ignored. Not with shouts in a tavern, not with revenge that would look like malice, but with clear, undeniable facts that would pierce the varnish. I began to gather testimonies. I wrote things down, dates, times, descriptions. When Samuel mentioned a specific night, a smell of wet tobacco, and the exact phrasing Marcus used, before he threatened to teach me a lesson, I wrote it down. I had the midwife's name who'd helped at my birth. I had the woman who had once helped clean father's post-brawl shirts. Each memory was a stitch. Gathering truth is not a noble act in a place that thrives on omission. It makes you visible, and visibility invites retaliation. One afternoon, a window in our house was cracked, so that rain came inside, though no storm had passed. Marcus laughed and said it was a joke, that the gutter had been loose, but I knew better. He had wanted to scare me, to remind me that he could touch my life in ways I could not fix. I could feel the cost in my bones. Our food grew colder, the nights grew longer. There were days when I would wake and not know how to gather the steady faith I needed to keep going. Samuel slept more fitfully. He was a child, but he felt the atmosphere like a small instrument tuned to tension. Yet every time I wanted to give in, I would reach under the floorboard and touch the tin with my hidden coins, feel the weight of the map Mr. Carter had given me, and know that the plan was not an idea. It was a future being built. I did not want to hurt anyone. I did not want to be the sort of person who took pleasure in another's downfall. My aim was simple. I wanted safety for my child, and dignity for the years I had been denied. The plan I constructed was precise: produce witnesses, present irrefutable accounts, and make the town have to choose between its comfort and its conscience. I started small. I arranged for Mrs. Hale to complain about a minor domestic dispute at the market. A plea about a man who had been too rough with his family. It was small enough to sound like a neighborly quibble, but it put an ear to the ground. I had Mr. Carter casually mention a night when Marcus had been especially violent. Each whisper was a test, a way to see how people would react when given a sliver of truth. Then I did something that felt like jumping off a cliff. I wrote down everything in an affidavit-like letter. Not legalese, just the plain facts of what I had lived. I asked Mrs. Duncan to keep it in her care. She did so with the solemnity of a librarian placing a rare book on a shelf. Samuel began to understand that our life had a purpose beyond survival. I taught him to hold his head high when he told simple truths. Uncle Marcus came home late, or he broke our chair. These were not dramatic accusations at first. They were small facts that, when repeated, would paint a fuller picture. "Will they listen?" he asked one night, mouth full of bread. "They will have to," I said. "If they don't, then the world has failed us. And perhaps then we'll have to make it listen a different way." His small hand found mine. "Mama, I want to help." "You already are," I whispered. "You already are. You cannot coax conscience into action. Sometimes you have to create an event so public it cannot be ignored." I knew I had to make them see what continued to happen under their roofs. I did not want to humiliate the town. I wanted to force accountability. So I created a circumstance, nothing violent, nothing that endangered Samuel, that would require a public response. On a Sunday when the church was full and the pews smelled of hymnals and candle wax, I walked up to the pastor after the sermon. My heart pounded. My hands were clammy. I had rehearsed nothing. The thing I carried, the thin note that had Mrs. Duncan's seal and several neighbor names, felt like a small bomb. I placed the folded paper on the pastor's desk, and, in a voice steady enough to surprise even myself, asked for a private talk. The pastor's eyes flicked to the congregation and then down to the paper. He raised an eyebrow. "Is this about the Johnsons?" he murmured. "It's about what happens in this house," I said. "It's about my son and my life. I need someone to listen." He took the paper, and at that moment a rustle went through me like winter wind. I had done what I could not before. I put truth into the hands of a man whose position would make it harder for others to ignore. The plan was no longer only mine. It had threads that reached into the community. Mrs. Hale's courage, Mr. Carter's map, Mrs. Duncan's books, Samuel's growing voice. But plans require timing. They require that you be patient enough to wait for the exact moment when the whole house is most brittle. That moment would come. Men like Marcus underestimate small women. They underestimate the power of a town that has shown the truth in daylight. They underestimate a mother who will not let her child be stolen by shame when the moment comes. And it is coming. It will not be the end. It will be the beginning of a reckoning. The meeting had been the first crack. What came after was the slow grind of machinery that had long been rusted, reluctant to move. The deputy returned with questions, scribbling in a notebook. He asked about dates, places, people who might verify. He asked whether I had proof. Proof, as if bruises weren't proof. As if whispers weren't proof. As if years of silence weren't the clearest evidence of all. But I answered anyway. I gave him the details I had gathered. The names of the witnesses who had already stepped forward. The notes I had hidden in hymnals and journals. He nodded, not unkindly, but with the wariness of a man who knew this would not be simple. Marcus and father were summoned. They went, swagger in their steps, smirks on their lips. They knew the law favored men like them, men with reputations, men with friends in high places, men who could twist the narrative. They denied everything. They called me unstable. They said I was bitter, unwell, ungrateful. But they underestimated one thing. The town had already seen. Rumors spread like fire. Some said I was brave. Others said I was dangerous. The truth sat somewhere in between, glowing hot in the center of every conversation. I heard the whispers when I passed the market. That's her, the one who accused her own blood. I saw the pity in the pastor's eyes, the judgment in Ruthie Ann's smirk. But I also heard a woman I barely knew murmur, "If she can speak, maybe I can too." That was when I realized this was no longer just about me. Samuel watched all of this unfold, his young eyes sharp with confusion and defiance. One evening, he asked, "Mama, why does everyone look at us like that?" "Because they don't know whether to be ashamed or proud," I told him. "Which should they be?" "Both," I said. He nodded, serious beyond his years. "I'm not ashamed. I'm proud." His words steadied me like a hand on my back when I thought I might fall. Marcus struck back in the only way he knew, through lies. He told the town I was sick, unstable, a danger to Samuel. He whispered that I had invented stories for attention, that I had poisoned the boy against his family. Father backed him with slurred speeches, nods from old drinking partners, mutters about hysterical women. For a moment, I feared their strategy would work. The mayor hesitated, the sheriff delayed. Even the pastor grew cooler toward me. But then Mrs. Hale stepped forward again, louder this time. "I've seen too much," she said at the market, her voice sharp enough for everyone to hear. "I won't let you make her a liar." Others followed. Mr. Carter spoke at the mill, his steady voice cutting through the noise. Mrs. Duncan wrote a letter that appeared in the local paper, cloaked as a reflection on truth and silence. The cracks in Marcus's facade widened. The confrontation came in the most public way possible. One Saturday, at the town square, where families gathered and vendors hawked their goods, Marcus confronted me. His voice rang out, "You've ruined this family with your lies." The crowd froze. Eyes turned. My heart pounded, but I stood tall. Samuel's hand in mine. "You ruined it yourself," I said, my voice calm, steady. Gasps rippled through the square. Marcus sneered, stepped closer, and for a terrifying moment, raised his hand. But this time, he wasn't in a shadowed hallway. He wasn't in the safety of a silent house. He was in the open, under the eyes of the town. And when his hand hovered in the air, the crowd shifted. A woman gasped. A man stepped forward. The deputy, watching from the edge, took a step closer. Marcus hesitated. His hand fell back to his side. For the first time in my life, I saw him powerless. That day in the square marked the turning point. Marcus had been exposed, not with bruises or whispers, but with his own raised hand in the daylight. The town could no longer pretend. The machinery of justice, slow as it was, began to shift more firmly in our favor. It wasn't the end. It wasn't freedom, but it was the first undeniable sign that their reign of fear was crumbling. And for the first time, I allowed myself to believe justice was not just possible, it was coming. Asterisk, when I first whispered that terrible, necessary word, revenge, into the dark, I did not imagine drama the way novels do. I did not see myself marching with a torch, or hiding in the shadows with a pistol. What I saw, in the quiet of my small kitchen, was Samuel asleep in the next room. Was a ledger. Names, dates, witnesses, patterns. I could unmake a life that had been built on lies, if I could assemble the truth in a way that could not be disputed. Revenge, for me, would be procedural. It would be public. It would be legal. It would force the town to look at what it had allowed. It would not be blood for blood. It would be the slow demolition of a reputation constructed from terror. The first step was to sharpen the witnesses, to make sure that when they spoke in front of others, their voices sounded like the voices of neighbors telling facts, not victims telling tales. The second step was to make sure the evidence could be placed on record. The third step was to control the narrative. Make the town see not a bitter woman, but a mother presenting facts about her life so her child could breathe. I began to organize in the daylight. Mrs. Hale, whose hands trembled when she held her knitting, became our official witness for late-night disturbances. Mr. Carter, who had once been content to mop classrooms and tidy up after-school plays, turned into the quiet man who could subpoena work records. Who could say under oath which nights Marcus had been seen staggering home from the mill? Mrs. Duncan, the librarian, printed out lists of books and references about legal procedure, and quieted me when my fear wanted to become a spectacle. She told me to breathe, to write, to collect. We met in kitchens and behind grocery counters. We used the language of ordinary people. No legalese, no melodrama, just facts. On the night of June 12th, I heard shouting and saw him hit her. On August 3rd, I saw bruises. On the third Sunday of March, I saw the woman carrying the child into Mrs. Hale's side door at midnight. These were the building blocks. When placed in sequence, they became a narrative the town could not easily dismiss. Samuel, in his growing bravery, had a role too. He learned to tell simple truths with the calmness of a witness. Uncle Marcus would come in angry. One time he broke our chair. The deputy taught him, gently, how to speak to a magistrate. I taught him to steady his breath before he answered. There is a kind of courage in a child who tells the truth when the whole world suggests falsehood. We hired a lawyer, a measured man named Mr. Ellison, who had grown up here but had learned the law in a city where things could be made right if the facts were correct. People whispered that hiring counsel was expensive. It was, but it was worth pennies for a life. He walked us through affidavits, helped me structure my testimony, and explained the slow mechanical beauty of subpoenas and witness statements. He taught me how to make the small things count: dates, names, smells, the sensory facts that lodged like pegs in memory and made testimony sturdy. We filed complaints. We gave sworn statements. Marcus and father, predictably, lead and hired their own lawyer, a thin man with a loud voice and a quick smile, who specialized in making men like them look small and pitiful, rather than monstrous. He accused me of slander. He had friends on the council. He called my story embellished. The courthouse became a new kind of battlefield, with paperwork as ammunition and testimony as the weapon. I remember sitting in that small office while Mr. Ellison explained how the wheels would turn. Depositions, interviews, the slow gathering of a case. It felt excruciatingly slow at times, but the pace suited me. Slow allowed me to make no mistakes. Slow let me gather every fact until there was no way to deny the pattern. Before the formal hearings, I needed the town to be ready. I worked the small channels of community life, Mrs. Hale's tea circle, the sewing guild, the women who ran the bake sales and kept the school alive. I told the truth to those who would listen. Not as accusation, but as request. Remember the dates. Remember the nights of drinking. Remember the times you saw Marcus in a rage. I asked them to record what they remembered on paper, to put it in ink. People are complicated. Some refused. Some wanted the easy comfort of denying what they had seen. But enough people agreed. Enough people would stand with me. When the hearing came, the magistrate would not see a single frightened woman raising a hand in a crowded room. He would see a chorus. He would see the town's testimony lined up like a file. Impossible to ignore, there are moments you plan that you know will hurt, not because they are cruel, but because they peel back the skin of a community and expose rawness. I organized a simple demonstration of the facts before the magistrate. A timeline rolled across a board. Photographs of bruises kept tasteful and clinical, the names of witnesses in neat columns. No rage, no pleading, just documentation. They laughed at first. Marcus's lawyer called it theatrics, meant to sway the weak. But salt makes meat real, and facts make stories trustable. The magistrate, a man tired of gossip but in love with records, asked us to submit the sheets. He allowed the deputy to call witnesses. The public dove into silence. When Mrs. Hale stood and testified about the nights, she heard shouting, and the time she saw. Marcus slammed me into the pantry. I watched the faces in the courtroom. Some sighed in relief, some scoffed. The thin man with the loud voice tried to discredit her. But she spoke plainly and stubbornly. And the truth has a way of landing like a stone, even when you try to bat it away. We did not expect grandeur. We expected small, vital steps. The first legal victory was not the removal of Marcus from our home, though that would come later. The first victory was that the deputy wrote a report we did not hand to the bottom drawer. The deputy filed the facts. The county pressed charges for domestic assault and coercion. The wheels creaked louder. When the charges were posted, the town could not pretend. People read the notice in the morning paper like you read obituaries. Stunned, scandalized, compelled. Marcus's friends clutched their cups in the diner and muttered. Father became guarded, eyes hollow. For once, their respectability could not smooth over the record. But the law is imperfect and slow, and men with money make rules bend. Marcus's lawyer filed motions to dismiss, to question the validity of witness statements, to muddy the water. He painted me as a woman whose memories were colored by hurt. He suggested that a family fight had been exaggerated. We met those moves with more paper, more witnesses, more careful statements. I learned to count patience like coin. Each hearing, each deposition, each corroborated memory became a brick in a wall I was building around our future. I had no illusions about how long it would take. I had only the steady belief that every fact mattered. Samuel sat through hearings that were gentle on the outside, but heavy for a child's shoulders. He grew steadier each time he was asked for small facts, each time he told what he had seen. He was not a spectacle. He was a witness, a small man testifying to the truth of his life. We practiced before each deposition, went through what he would say, how he would breathe, how he would speak clearly. Sometimes, at night, he would ask if the men would go to jail. I don't know, I would tell him honestly, but I know that you will have a chance to decide who you are, without someone else telling you. He took that as enough. The courthouse in Portsmouth was not grand, a square brick building with tired steps and windows that had seen more gossip than justice. But to me, it felt like a theater. Every creak of the benches, every scrape of a chair, every cough in the back row carried weight. This was where decades of silence would either harden into stone or shatter under the hammer of truth. Marcus sat across from me, his lawyer whispering in his ear. He looked smaller than he ever had in the kitchen of our home, but his arrogance wrapped him like armor. Father slumped beside him, eyes glazed, clinging to bourbon even in daylight. They thought their reputations would shield them. They thought the town's reluctance to interfere would continue. But the moment the first witness spoke, their armor cracked. Mrs. Hale testified first. Her voice wavered, but her words did not. She told the magistrate about nights of shouting, about the fear on my face when I came to her door with Samuel feverish in my arms. She spoke about the bruises she had seen, the way she had patched my clothes when they were torn. Mr. Carter followed, steady and unshakable. He told the truth about Marcus's drinking, about the threats overheard, about the time he had seen Samuel crying in the yard, while Marcus shouted. Mrs. Duncan read from the notes she had carefully preserved. Dates, times, corroborations that lined up with my own journals. Each testimony was a nail, hammered carefully, rhythmically, into the coffin of Marcus's respectability. When they called me, I stood on legs that trembled but held. I told the story not as tragedy but as fact. I did not embellish. I did not weep. I spoke in the steady voice of a mother who had lived through hell and now demanded to be heard. I told them about the nights of control, the threats to take Samuel, the way the town's silence had been both shield and weapon. I held nothing back, though I spared the courtroom details that would wound Samuel further. My goal was not spectacle. My goal was truth, undeniable. Marcus's lawyer tried to paint me as bitter, unstable, vengeful. He called me a woman scorned. He pointed to my allies as meddlesome, but the facts spoke louder. And when Samuel, brave beyond his years, stood and spoke simply, he scared me. He scared Mama. I don't want to live scared anymore. Even the magistrate's stern face softened. The verdict was not swift, and it was not perfect. The court did not throw Marcus and father into chains forever. Small towns rarely work that way. But the ruling was clear. Marcus was charged with assault and coercion. Father was placed under restrictions, barred from contact. Samuel and I were granted protection, legal recognition that the house we lived in had never been safe. It was not the whole of justice, but it was enough to begin rebuilding. The town buzzed. Some called me brave. Others called me dangerous. Friends of Marcus avoided me. Women I had never spoken to slipped me notes of thanks, whispers of their own silent battles. The pastor delivered a sermon about truth, careful not to name names, but pointed enough to shake pews. Marcus left town soon after, unable to face the eyes that now judged him. Father dwindled, shrinking into a shadow of himself, until one day the chair he always sat in stood empty. The house lost its monsters, but the ghosts lingered. They always do. In the weeks after, Samuel walked taller. He laughed more freely, though shadows sometimes flickered across his face. One evening he asked me, "Are we safe now?" "We're safer," I told him. "Safe enough to build a life, safe enough to dream." And that night, for the first time in years, we both slept without checking the locks twice. After the courthouse doors closed behind us, the world seemed almost too quiet. For years, silence had been my prison, a silence of shame, of control, of townsfolk turning their heads. But now the silence was different. It was spacious. It was a silence that belonged to me. For the first time, I could walk the market without Marcus's shadow at my back. I could sit on the church steps with Samuel without fearing Father's slurred orders. I could breathe without counting the ways danger might slip through the cracks of a door. Freedom is not loud when it first arrives. It is quiet. Like a room finally aired out after years of smoke. We did not rebuild overnight. The damage was layered, and healing came in fragments. Mrs. Hale helped us scrub the house from top to bottom. Not just the dust and grime, but the memories embedded in the walls. "Make it yours," she told me, handing me a brush. We painted over the pantry door where Marcus had once cornered me, turning it the color of dawn. Mr. Carter fixed the broken windows and repaired the roof. He refused payment, saying only, "You've carried enough." Mrs. Duncan brought books for Samuel's stories, not of war or fear, but of adventure and discovery, she told me. He deserves new dreams. Each act was small, but together they stitched a new fabric over the torn edges of our life. Samuel blossomed in freedom. He ran barefoot in the yard, his laughter unchained. He asked questions about stars, about trains, about places beyond Portsmouth. One evening, he sat at the table, pencil scratching against paper. "I want to write our story," he said. My hands froze over the bread I was slicing. "Why? So people don't forget," he answered simply. "So it doesn't happen again." I kissed the top of his head. My boy had turned witness into legacy. The town's relationship with me remained complicated. Some offered polite nods, unable to meet my eyes. Others stopped me at the market, squeezing my hand, whispering thanks. Ruthie Ann avoided me altogether. Shame or spite, I couldn't tell. But the important part was this. No one dared call me a liar anymore. They might avoid, they might whisper, but the record stood. The truth was etched into the courthouse files, into the memory of the square where Marcus faltered, into the quiet bravery of those who testified. The silence of denial had been broken. Revenge had begun as a whisper in my chest, a word too dangerous to speak aloud. Over time, it had grown into strategy, into testimony, into a verdict. But here, in the rebuilding, I realized something new. Revenge was not just about tearing them down. It was about lifting us up. Every coin saved, every wall painted, every laugh Samuel released into the open air. That was revenge too. Because the greatest blow to men who thrive on control is not their punishment. It is your survival. It is your joy. I began to meet with other women quietly. At first, it was in Mrs. Hale's kitchen, tea steaming in chipped cups. Then it was the back room of the library, Mrs. Duncan turning the key in the door. We shared stories, not just mine, but theirs. Stories of silence, of fear, of scars carried in secret. We made a pact. None of us would be silent again. We would remember for one another. We would stand for one another. Samuel would sometimes sit nearby, drawing or listening. I knew he was, absorbing it all, the bravery, the sorrow, the determination. One day, when I am gone, he will carry it further than I ever could. It is one thing to survive. It is another to speak survival aloud. For months after the courthouse, I thought I might stay quiet. After all, the verdict was written, the house was ours, Marcus gone, father fading into the shadows of his own ruin. But silence has never been neutral. It is either prison or power. And I refused to let my silence be prison again, so I began to tell. At first in whispers, 2 women in kitchens, 2 children who asked why Mama cried in the night. Then, in stronger tones, to neighbors who finally asked the right questions. To men who looked uncomfortable and shifted on their feet. Each time I told it, the shame loosened its grip. Each time, the weight shifted from me to the world where it belonged. Samuel grew quickly in those years. The boy who once hid in closets now stood tall, shoulders back, voice steady. He became the kind of child who asked hard questions at school, who refused to laugh at cruel jokes, who told teachers, "We don't stay silent anymore." He was my proof that cycles could be broken. He was my revenge in motion. Not because he carried bitterness, but because he carried clarity. He would never repeat the sins of those men. He would never call silence safety. One night, he told me, "Mama, when I'm older, I'll make sure everyone knows what happened here. Not just to us, to others too." And I believed him. That was when I realized revenge had taken its final form. It was no longer about Marcus or father. Their shadows had withered. My true revenge was making sure that no child, no woman, No soul would ever suffer in silence again, without knowing that resistance was possible. I began to speak at small gatherings, church basements, community halls, even classrooms. I didn't dramatize. I told the truth, plain and unvarnished, the way I had in court. I said, "This happened. I survived. And you can too." At first, people shifted uncomfortably, the way they always do when truth cuts through politeness. But then others began to nod, to whisper, to add their voices. Stories spread. One woman confessed she had been waiting 20 years to tell hers. Another said she had thought she was alone. The circle grew, and with it, so did the power. It would be too simple to say the whole town changed. Not everyone did. Some remained silent. Some still looked away. Some muttered that I had ruined a family's name. But others began to act differently. The sheriff's office handled complaints with more urgency. The pastor spoke sermons about protection, not patience. A committee was formed to offer help quietly to women who needed it. Even the children learned new lessons. They grew up hearing that silence was dangerous, that truth was heavy but holy. That was legacy. That was the kind of revenge that ripples for generations. As for me, I did not live happily ever after. That is not how stories like mine end. But I lived freely. I lived on my own terms. I lived in a house scrubbed of ghosts, walls painted the color of mourning. I lived watching Samuel grow into a man who walked without chains. And that, to me, was peace. Never underestimate a mother's silence. It is not weakness. It is not surrender. It is strategy. And when silence breaks, when a woman finally speaks, the world shakes.